Jeremy Bentham was born in 1748 in London, at the heart of an England undergoing profound transformation. The 18th century was the age of enlightenment, but also a time of economic and social upheavals that heralded the Industrial Revolution. Factories multiplied, cities swelled, inequalities deepened, and the institutions inherited from the past appeared increasingly unfit for this new world. It was in this context that Bentham, a child prodigy, developed an early passion for law and philosophy. It is said that by the age of 3 he was already reading legal treatises, and by 12 he was attending lectures at Oxford. Yet, it was not the traditional English legal system, bound by custom and precedent, that captivated him, but rather the conviction that the very foundations of morality and politics needed to be rethought. The question that haunted him was simple yet radical. How can we judge whether a law, an institution, or an action is good or bad? Traditional moral systems appealed to religion, custom, or abstract principles. Bentham, however, sought a criterion that was concrete, rational, and universal. His answer would become one of the most influential ideas of modernity. An action is good if it tends to increase happiness, and bad if it tends to produce suffering. This is the essence of utilitarianism, the doctrine that would make Bentham one of the defining thinkers of his time. Bentham formulated what he called the principle of utility, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. This principle became his compass for both moral and political judgment. Where others invoked natural rights or divine commandments, Bentham proposed a measurable criterion: pleasure and pain. Good and evil were not mysterious essences. They were grounded in the lived experience of individuals. Happiness became the measure of all things. To make this principle operational, Bentham devised what he called a calculus of pleasures and pains. Each action, he suggested, could be evaluated according to several criteria: its intensity, duration, certainty, proximity, fecundity, its capacity to generate further pleasures, purity, its freedom from ensuing pains, and extent, the number of people affected. This calculation, sometimes referred to as moral arithmetic, sought to give a rational foundation to individual and collective decision-making. It was not a metaphor. Bentham genuinely believed that pleasures and pains could be measured, compared, and quantified. This ambition may seem naive, yet it was profoundly revolutionary. It broke with centuries of moral thought based on authority, tradition, or revelation. It proposed a universal, accessible, and secular standard, independent of particular beliefs. It paved the way for a morality that was rational, democratic, and grounded in experience. Bentham was not merely a theorist, he was a reformer. He applied his principle of utility to law, politics, and economics. He denounced cruel and unnecessary punishments, advocated for institutional transparency, and proposed reforms to the prison system. His famous Panopticon project, a circular prison in which a single guard could observe all inmates, illustrates both the ingenuity and the ambiguities of his thought. On the one hand, it reflected his concern for efficiency and the reduction of suffering. On the other, it envisioned a system of total surveillance that would later provoke sharp criticism. Bentham was also a pioneer of social liberalism. He defended freedom of expression, gender equality, the decriminalization of homosexuality, and representative democracy. His arguments were not grounded in abstract rights, but in utility. What mattered was whether a rule maximized collective happiness. This approach led him to remarkably modern positions, often more than a century ahead of his time. The legacy of Bentham's utilitarianism is immense. His disciple John Stuart Mill refined it by distinguishing between higher and lower pleasures. In the 20th century, it inspired welfare economics, cost-benefit analysis, and numerous public policy frameworks. Even today, Bentham's influence persists in debates on social justice, public health, animal ethics, and artificial intelligence. Yet, from the outset, utilitarianism has faced powerful criticisms. It has been accused of reducing morality to a mere calculation, of neglecting individual dignity, and of justifying injustices if they increase overall happiness. Immanuel Kant, for instance, rejected it outright. For him, morality could not depend on consequences, but only on universal principles. These critiques, examined later, show that utilitarianism is a living philosophy, one that continues to provoke reflection and controversy. This first section therefore sets the stage. Bentham, the reformist philosopher, proposes a morality grounded in happiness, measurable through pleasure and pain, and applicable to every sphere of social life. The guiding question for what follows is clear. How does this principle of utility unfold within logic, law, politics, and society? And what are its strengths and its limits? The principle of utility is the beating heart of Jeremy Bentham's philosophy. His entire moral and political system rests on this simple yet radical idea. An action, a law, or an institution has value only through its consequences. And those consequences must be evaluated in terms of pleasure and pain, happiness and suffering. Where traditional moralities appealed to divine will, custom, or supposed immutable natural rights, Bentham proposed a criterion that was concrete, universal, and rational: the happiness of the individuals concerned. Good is not a mysterious essence, nor is it inscribed in nature or revelation. It is whatever increases happiness, while evil is whatever increases suffering. Bentham formulates this principle in his major work, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, 1789. There he writes that nature has placed humanity under the governance of two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. They determine what we ought to do, and they determine what we shall do. Every morality, every system of law, every political order must therefore be guided by a single criterion: maximize pleasure, minimize pain. This is what Bentham calls the principle of utility. This principle is revolutionary in several respects. First, it breaks with religious moralities. Whereas the Christian tradition grounded goodness in conformity to divine law, Bentham offers an immanent criterion, accessible to all and independent of any particular belief system. Second, it breaks with theories of natural rights, which invoked innate, abstract, and often unprovable claims. For Bentham, such natural rights were mere nonsense upon stilts. What matters is not a right proclaimed, but the actual utility of a rule in promoting collective happiness. Finally, it breaks with deontological ethics, which judge actions by their intrinsic nature rather than their outcomes. For Bentham, only consequences matter. An action is good if it produces happiness, and bad if it produces suffering. The principle of utility has universal scope. It applies to all human actions, individual and collective alike. It governs laws, institutions, and public policies. It also guides ordinary moral judgments. Whenever we must choose, we should ask, does this action increase happiness or suffering? And not only our own, but that of all those affected. That is why Bentham speaks of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Happiness, for him, is not merely individual, it is collective. This principle is also profoundly democratic. It rejects privilege, arbitrary hierarchy, and exclusion. Every person counts for one, and no one counts for more than one. The happiness of the rich is worth no more than that of the poor. The happiness of the powerful, no more than that of the weak. Utilitarianism is an egalitarian philosophy. It places all individuals on the same plane and judges institutions by their capacity to maximize collective well-being. But the principle also raises difficult questions. How can happiness be measured? How can pleasures and pains be compared? How can conflicting interests be balanced? Bentham was aware of these challenges, and he proposed a method, the calculus of pleasures and pains, which will be examined in the next section. Yet, even here, it is crucial to understand that the principle of utility is not a magic formula. It is a compass. It does not always provide an immediate answer, but it offers a universal standard to guide reflection. The implications of this principle are immense. It provides a tool for criticizing unjust laws, challenging cruel institutions, and questioning absurd customs. It offers a foundation for reform, innovation, and progress. It grounds a secular, rational, and democratic morality, and it opens the way to a politics of happiness, where the purpose of the state is not to preserve privilege or tradition, but to maximize the well-being of all. Even today, the principle of utility remains strikingly relevant. In debates on social justice, public health, environmental ethics, or artificial intelligence, the central question remains the same. What are the consequences for human happiness? How can we maximize benefits and minimize suffering? Bentham's utilitarianism provides a framework for thinking through these issues, even as its limits invite ongoing discussion. Thus, the principle of utility stands as the cornerstone of utilitarianism. Simple in its formulation, vast in its implications, it breaks with traditional moralities, establishes a rational and democratic ethics, and shifts the focus to consequences, placing happiness at the very center. From this foundation, Bentham would go on to build his calculus of pleasures and pains, his legal and political reforms, and inspire successors such as John Stuart Mill, who would further develop and refine utilitarianism. The principle of utility, in order to be truly operative, had to take shape in a concrete method. Bentham was not the kind of philosopher content with grand abstractions. He wanted to provide legislators, judges, and citizens with a practical tool for evaluating actions and institutions. Thus, he developed what he called the calculus of pleasures and pains, a genuine moral arithmetic. The idea seems simple at first glance. If good and evil are measured by pleasure and pain, then there must be a way to compare, add, subtract, and balance these experiences. Yet this simple idea opens an immense field of inquiry, for it assumes that we can somehow quantify what appears most subjective, our experiences of happiness and suffering. Bentham proposed several criteria for evaluating a pleasure or a pain. The first is intensity. A vivid pleasure counts more than a mild one, and an intense pain weighs more heavily than a slight one. The second is duration. A lasting pleasure is more valuable than a fleeting one, and a prolonged pain more burdensome than a brief one. The third is certainty. A probable pleasure is worth more than an uncertain one, and a certain pain weighs more than a hypothetical one. The fourth is propinquity, or proximity in time. An immediate pleasure carries more weight than a distant one, and an imminent pain counts more than one that is remote. To these, Bentham adds fecundity, the capacity of a pleasure to generate further pleasures, or of a pain to generate further pains. Purity, the extent to which a pleasure is not followed by pain, or a pain not followed by pleasure. And finally, extent, meaning the number of people affected. These criteria form an evaluative framework. Faced with an action, one might ask, what pleasure does it produce? With what intensity, duration, certainty, or immediacy? What are its side effects, its long-term consequences? How many people are impacted? By summing the pleasures and the pains, taking into account their intensity, duration, and scope, one can calculate the overall utility of an action. Bentham never claimed this calculation was easy. He knew that pleasures and pains are hard to measure, that they vary from person to person, and that they often resist quantification. But he emphasized the importance of the attempt. Even an approximate calculation, he argued, is better than arbitrary judgment. Even if measurement is imperfect, we can still compare, estimate, and reason. The moral arithmetic is a method, not an infallible machine. It forces us to consider consequences, to think about the happiness of all, and to move beyond judgments grounded in tradition or prejudice. This calculus carries profound implications. It allows us to criticize excessively harsh penal laws. A cruel punishment that inflicts intense and lasting suffering without producing a proportionate collective benefit is unjustifiable. It can also justify social reforms. A measure that brings a small pleasure to many people may be more valuable than one that brings a great pleasure to a few. It can guide political decision-making. Public policy should be judged not by its conformity to tradition, but by its measurable usefulness in promoting collective well-being. Bentham applied this calculus to very concrete domains. In criminal law, he proposed that punishments be proportionate to offenses, taking into account not only the gravity of the act, but also the deterrent effect of the sanction. In economics, he reflected on the distribution of wealth, showing that the marginal utility of income is greater for the poor than for the rich. In politics, he advocated for transparent and accountable institutions capable of maximizing public happiness. The calculus of pleasures and pains is also a critical weapon. It enables the denunciation of absurd customs, superstitions, and privileges. Why maintain a cruel practice if it produces more suffering than happiness? Why defend an unjust institution if it benefits only a minority at the expense of the majority? The calculus demands that every rule, every law, every decision be justified by its real consequences. Of course, this approach raises objections. Can happiness truly be measured? Can pleasures and pains be compared? Can subjective experiences be added together? Bentham replied that, even if measurement is imperfect, it is preferable to the absence of any measure at all. In everyday life, we already make implicit comparisons. We choose between two pleasures. We weigh an immediate pleasure against a future one. We balance advantages and disadvantages. The utilitarian calculus merely systematizes this spontaneous practice. Even today, Bentham's calculus continues to inspire modern methods. Cost-benefit analysis, used in economics and public policy, rests on the same logic, comparing gains and losses, advantages and disadvantages to determine the best course of action. Debates on public health, environmental policy, and social justice often rely, explicitly or not, on utilitarian reasoning. The calculus of pleasures and pains thus represents a bold attempt to make morality rational and universal. It does not claim to eliminate subjectivity, but offers a method for guiding our choices toward the greatest happiness of the greatest number. It embodies Bentham's reformist spirit, the desire to subject institutions to reason, to ground morality in experience, and to give philosophy a practical and transformative role. Bentham's utilitarianism was never meant to remain an abstract theory. It took shape in a concrete reflection on law and politics. Trained as a jurist, Bentham saw in the law a privileged field for applying his principle of utility. For him, laws should not be judged by their antiquity, prestige, or conformity to tradition, but by their real consequences on human happiness. A good law is one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain. A bad law is one that produces more suffering than happiness. This approach led him to a scathing critique of English law in his time. founded on custom and precedent, which he saw as confused, archaic, and unjust. He called instead for a clear, rational, and accessible codification grounded in the principle of utility. In the field of criminal law, Bentham proposed a radical reform. He denounced cruel and disproportionate punishments that inflicted needless suffering without yielding collective benefit. For him, punishment is justified only if it prevents a greater evil. It must be proportionate to the offense, sufficient to deter, but no more. Any punishment that exceeds this necessity is pure evil, an unnecessary source of pain. This utilitarian approach to criminal justice is profoundly modern. It grounds the legitimacy of punishment not in vengeance or abstract morality, but in social utility. Bentham also extended his principle to the organization of institutions. He emphasized transparency, accountability, and rational design. Institutions, he argued, should be constructed to maximize collective happiness, not to preserve privilege or tradition. It was in this context that he conceived his famous panopticon, a circular prison where a single guard, positioned at the center, could observe all inmates without being seen. This design sought to maximize the efficiency of surveillance, reduce costs, and improve discipline. For Bentham, it exemplified the utilitarian calculus, achieving the greatest effect with the least means. Yet the panopticon also exposes the ambiguities of utilitarianism. On one hand, it expresses the desire to reduce suffering and render punishment more rational and efficient. On the other, it establishes a regime of total surveillance, potentially oppressive and dehumanizing. Michel Foucault, in Discipline and Punish, would later interpret it as the symbol of modern disciplinary power. The panopticon thus embodies a central tension within utilitarianism. In striving to maximize collective happiness, it may justify mechanisms that restrict individual freedom. Bentham did not limit himself to criminal law. He also reflected on constitutional design, political representation, and democracy. He defended broader suffrage, freedom of expression, and governmental accountability, always in the name of utility. What matters, for Bentham, is not an abstract right, but the capacity of an institution to maximize collective happiness. Democracy, therefore, is not a value in itself, but a means to ensure that laws reflect the interests of the greatest number. Freedom of expression is not a sacred right, but a useful one, because it enables the circulation of ideas, the exposure of abuses, and the improvement of institutions. Applied to law and politics, utilitarianism becomes a philosophy of reform. It is not about preserving the established order, but about transforming it according to its utility. Bentham attacked privilege, custom, and superstition. He wanted laws that were clear, rational, and useful, institutions that were transparent, accountable, and effective, and a politics directed toward collective happiness, not the glory of princes or the defense of traditions. Even today, Bentham's approach remains strikingly relevant. Debates about the proportionality of punishment, the transparency of institutions, and the efficiency of public policy are deeply utilitarian in nature. The notion that laws should be judged by their consequences rather than their conformity to tradition has become a guiding principle in many fields. Yet the ambiguities persist. How far can we go in the name of utility? Can individual freedoms be curtailed for the sake of collective happiness? The panopticon endures as a powerful metaphor for this dilemma. Thus, Bloch illustrates how Bentham applied his principle of utility to law and politics. He condemned cruel and useless laws, proposed rational reforms, and designed efficient institutions. But he also exposed the core tensions of utilitarianism, between collective happiness and individual liberty, between efficiency and human dignity. These tensions would fuel centuries of debate, shaping both the critiques and the legacy of utilitarian thought. Bentham's utilitarianism does not stop at law or political institutions. It extends to society as a whole, to the ways in which individuals live together, recognize one another, govern themselves, and transform their world. Bentham was not only a jurist or a legal theorist, he was a social reformer, convinced that the principle of utility should guide every aspect of collective life. His philosophy was not an abstract speculation, but a practical compass aimed at improving the human condition. In an England still marked by rigid social hierarchies, hereditary privilege, and widespread discrimination, Bentham dared to proclaim that each counts for one, and no one counts for more than one. This phrase, destined to become a rallying cry of utilitarianism, is profoundly egalitarian. It means that the happiness of the rich is worth no more than that of the poor, the pleasure of the powerful no more than that of the weak, the suffering of the marginalized no less than that of the respected. This was a silent revolution. In a society structured by privilege, Bentham proposed a morality that placed all individuals on an equal footing. This principle of equality led Bentham to surprisingly modern positions. He defended freedom of expression, not as an abstract right, but as a condition for collective utility. A society in which ideas circulate freely is one capable of correcting its errors, improving its institutions, and maximizing happiness. He supported representative democracy, not out of romantic idealism, but because it better reflects the interests of the greatest number. He condemned discrimination, especially against women and homosexuals, and advocated bold reforms for his time. Bentham was one of the first thinkers to explicitly defend the decriminalization of homosexuality. In a society where same-sex relations were criminalized and stigmatized, he had the courage to affirm that consensual acts cause no harm and therefore should not be punished. His reasoning was simple and powerful. If an action produces pleasure without causing pain to others, it is useful, and there is no reason to prohibit it. This stance, centuries ahead of its public acceptance, shows just how progressive utilitarianism can be, capable of challenging prejudice and moral taboo through rational ethics. Similarly, Bentham addressed the condition of women. He criticized the legal and social inequalities that oppressed them and called for greater equality. His reasoning, once again, was utilitarian. Why deprive society of women's potential contributions? Why maintain forms of discrimination that produce suffering and reduce collective happiness? Equality is not merely a moral demand. It is a demand of utility. Bentham also turned his attention to poverty, education, and public health. He proposed reforms to improve the lives of the most vulnerable, to make society more just, more rational, and happier. He viewed education as a powerful means of maximizing collective happiness by enabling each individual to develop their capacities. He saw public health as a legitimate field for state action, reducing suffering and increasing well-being across society. Applied to society, utilitarianism thus becomes a philosophy of reform and transformation. It is not limited to codifying laws or softening punishments. It seeks to rethink society itself according to the criterion of collective happiness. Even today, this social dimension of utilitarianism remains strikingly relevant. Debates on gender equality, minority rights, social justice, and public health all implicitly draw on utilitarian reasoning, even when not named as such. The same question always reappears. What consequences does this have for human happiness? How can we maximize benefits and minimize suffering? Utilitarianism provides a rational framework for addressing these issues, even as its limits continue to provoke debate. Thus, Block 5 reveals that Bentham's utilitarianism is not merely a theory of law or politics, but a social philosophy, one that applies to every dimension of collective life. It defends equality, freedom of expression, democracy, minority rights, education, and health. It offers a compass for reforming society, for making it more just, more rational, and ultimately, more conducive to happiness. The legacy of Bentham is immense, extending far beyond his own writings. His thought opened a path that would be taken up, transformed, criticized, and expanded by generations of philosophers, economists, jurists, and reformers. From the moment of his death in 1832, his disciples diverged in their interpretations, yet all acknowledged that the principle of utility had fundamentally changed the way humanity conceives morality and politics. Utilitarianism became a school, a movement, a living tradition. The first great heir to Bentham was John Stuart Mill. The son of James Mill, Bentham's close collaborator, John Stuart was raised in a thoroughly utilitarian environment. But he did not merely echo his master's doctrines. He refined, corrected, and enriched them. Whereas Bentham regarded all pleasures as equivalent, measurable only by their intensity, duration, and certainty, Mill introduced a qualitative distinction. He argued that there are higher and lower pleasures. Intellectual, aesthetic, and moral pleasures are superior to purely physical ones. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, he wrote in Utilitarianism. This distinction answered a common criticism, that Bentham's utilitarianism seemed to reduce morality to a crude pursuit of pleasure, as if humans were nothing more than calculating animals. Mill demonstrated that utilitarianism could take into account not only the quantity, but also the quality of pleasures. Mill also extended utilitarianism into the realm of politics. And on liberty, he defended individual freedom as a condition for collective happiness. He asserted that society should limit an individual's liberty only to prevent harm to others. This idea, known as the harm principle, became a cornerstone of modern liberalism. It showed that utilitarianism was not merely an arithmetic of pleasure, but also a political philosophy valuing freedom as a means of promoting overall happiness. Bentham's legacy did not end with Mill. Throughout the 19th century, utilitarianism inspired numerous social reformers. It influenced political economy, particularly the theory of welfare. It inspired legal, penal, and educational reforms. It fueled debates about democracy, representation, and rights, becoming an essential reference point in discussions on justice and ethics. In the 20th century, utilitarianism experienced a renewal through philosophers such as Henry Sidgwick, who systematized the doctrine, and Peter Singer, who applied it to animal ethics and bioethics. Singer, for instance, revived the principle of utility to defend the moral consideration of animals. If suffering is the criterion of evil, then animal suffering must matter as much as human suffering. Utilitarianism thus became a powerful tool for expanding the circle of moral concern. Utilitarian ideas also shaped modern public policy. Cost-benefit analysis, used to evaluate economic projects, healthcare measures, and environmental policies, is rooted in a utilitarian logic, weighing advantages and disadvantages, maximizing benefits, and minimizing costs. Contemporary debates on vaccination, road safety, and climate change often rely on utilitarian reasoning, even when not explicitly identified as such. Yet Bentham's legacy is not without controversy. Critics argue that utilitarianism can sacrifice the individual to the collective, justifying injustices if they increase overall happiness. Others point to the difficulty of measuring pleasure and pain or comparing subjective experiences. Still others denounce the danger of reducing morality to a cold calculation, blind to dignity, rights, and moral principles. These critiques have fueled passionate debates and pushed Bentham's heirs to refine, correct, and deepen the doctrine. Thus, Bentham's legacy is twofold. On one side, it has inspired fruitful developments: Mill, Sidgwick, Singer, welfare economics, bioethics, public policy. On the other, it has provoked enduring critiques that have shaped modern philosophy: Kant, the deontologists, rights theorists, and existentialists. Bentham remains both a master and a rival, a model and a foil. His thought continues to live on, not only in the works of his followers, but also in the ongoing debates about justice, freedom, and happiness. Bentham's utilitarianism, despite its power and reformist ambition, provoked deep criticism from the very beginning. These critiques are not mere objections to specific points. They strike at the very heart of the doctrine, its definition of the good, its claim to measure happiness, and its relationship to justice and human dignity. To understand these criticisms is to grasp the limits of utilitarianism, but also the ways in which it has been forced to transform and defend itself. The first major critique comes from the Kantian tradition. For Kant, morality cannot depend on consequences, because consequences are always uncertain, variable, and unpredictable. Morality must rest on universal principles, valid in all circumstances, independent of outcomes. The moral duty, according to Kant, is to treat every person as an end in themselves, never merely as a means. Yet utilitarianism, in seeking to maximize collective happiness, runs the risk of sacrificing some individuals for the greater good. It thereby treats them as mere means, variables in a calculation. For Kant, this constitutes a profound violation of human dignity. This critique is formidable. It shows that utilitarianism, in striving to be rational and universal, can in fact justify injustice. If overall happiness increases, why not sacrifice a minority? Why not punish an innocent person if it appeases a crowd and prevents riots? Why not exploit some individuals if it benefits the majority? Utilitarianism seems unable to guarantee fundamental rights, absolute limits, or inviolable prohibitions. A second critique concerns the very possibility of measuring happiness. Bentham proposed a calculus of pleasures and pains, but can subjective experiences truly be compared? Can one add up one person's pleasure with another's? Can we place on the same scale an aesthetic pleasure and a physical one, a moral pain and a bodily one? The idea of a moral arithmetic is seductive, yet it seems to ignore the complexity and diversity of human experience. John Stuart Mill himself, Bentham's heir, recognized this problem and introduced the distinction between higher and lower pleasures to answer the charge of a philosophy for swine. But this distinction, by introducing a qualitative hierarchy, moved away from Bentham's quantitative model. A third critique concerns the distribution of happiness. Utilitarianism seeks to maximize the total sum of pleasures, but pays little attention to how they are distributed. It could justify a society where a small minority suffers greatly, as long as the majority enjoys great happiness. It might accept extreme inequality so long as the total happiness is maximized. This indifference to distributive justice was denounced by many thinkers, notably John Rawls in the 20th century. Rawls argued that justice is not merely about maximizing total happiness, but about guaranteeing equal rights and protecting the least advantaged. Utilitarianism, in his view, fails to respect fairness because it too easily sacrifices individuals for the collective. A fourth critique addresses the coldness of utilitarian calculation. Reducing morality to an addition of pleasures and pains, according to its opponents, ignores the depth of human experience. Human beings are not mere centers of sensation, nor machines calculating interests. They are beings of dignity, freedom, and spirituality. By focusing on what can be quantified, utilitarianism overlooks what is immeasurable. It neglects the intrinsic value of certain actions, principles, and relationships. It sees only consequences and forgets meaning. Finally, a fifth critique points to the potential abuses of utilitarianism. In seeking to maximize collective happiness, it can justify authoritarian measures, systems of surveillance, and restrictions on freedom. Bentham's panopticon symbolizes this danger. Conceived to maximize efficiency and minimize suffering, it simultaneously establishes a regime of total control. Utilitarianism can thus become an instrumental rationality, one that sacrifices freedom in the name of efficiency and reduces human beings to objects of management. Michel Foucault later showed how this logic could fuel modern forms of disciplinary power. These critiques do not necessarily condemn utilitarianism outright, but they have forced it to evolve. Bentham's heirs, Mill, Sidgwick, Singer, and others, have tried to respond. Mill introduced the qualitative distinction among pleasures. Sidgwick sought to systematize and strengthen the doctrine's internal coherence. Singer expanded the moral circle to include animals, in order to counter the charge of human-centered egoism. Yet the criticisms persist, and they continue to animate debates in ethics, politics, and legal philosophy today. Thus, Block 7 shows that utilitarianism, despite its intellectual strength, is riddled with tensions and limits. It is accused of sacrificing the individual to the collective, of reducing morality to calculation, of ignoring distributive justice, of neglecting human dignity, and of justifying authoritarian excesses. These critiques have not destroyed utilitarianism, but they have compelled it to evolve, defend itself, and reinvent its foundations. Utilitarianism remains a living philosophy precisely because it continues to be challenged, debated, and criticized. Bentham's utilitarianism is not a mere curiosity of the 18th century. It is a philosophy that continues to haunt our contemporary debates, often without our realizing it. Its strength lies in having proposed a simple and universal criterion to judge actions, laws, and institutions by their consequences on happiness and suffering. Its weakness lies in having believed that the complexity of human life could be reduced to calculation. Yet it is precisely this tension that makes utilitarianism a living, ever-debated, and ever-relevant philosophy. Today, utilitarian logic can be found everywhere in public policy. When a government evaluates a health measure by comparing lives saved to financial costs, it reasons in utilitarian terms. When we debate mandatory vaccination, we weigh collective benefits against individual constraints. When discussing road safety, we compare lives spared to the money spent. When addressing climate change, we balance economic costs against environmental benefits. In every case, the logic is the same. Maximize benefits, minimize suffering. Seek the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Utilitarian reasoning also permeates medical ethics. Debates about the allocation of healthcare resources, organ transplants, and intensive care decisions often invoke utilitarian principles. Should priority go to the patients with the highest chance of survival? Should resources be distributed where they produce the most benefit? These are painful questions, but they show that the principle of utility remains a moral compass, even if it does not always provide a clear or final answer. In animal ethics, utilitarianism has played a decisive role. Peter Singer, Bentham's intellectual heir, argued that if suffering is the criterion of evil, then animal suffering must also count. Bentham himself had already posed the essential question: The question is not, can they reason? Nor can they talk, but can they suffer? This sentence, written in the 18th century, still resonates today in debates about factory farming, animal experimentation, and veganism. Utilitarianism thus expands the circle of moral concern and compels us to think beyond the human species. In the realm of technology, utilitarian reasoning is omnipresent. Debates over artificial intelligence, algorithms, and data protection are steeped in utilitarian logic. Should a technology be permitted if it maximizes collective well-being, even at the cost of some individual freedoms? Should an innovation be banned if its risks outweigh its benefits? Utilitarianism provides a framework for grappling with such dilemmas, even though its limits quickly become apparent. Yet the relevance of utilitarianism today does not lie only in its influence. It also lies in the critiques it provokes. In a world obsessed with efficiency, performance, costs, and benefits, utilitarianism can become a dominant ideology that reduces everything to numbers, forgetting dignity, rights, and moral principles. Kantian, Rawlsian, and existentialist critiques therefore remain essential. They remind us that happiness cannot justify everything, that some rights are inviolable, and that certain values are beyond measurement. Bentham's lesson is therefore twofold. On one hand, he gives us a compass. Think in terms of consequences, seek to maximize happiness, reject arbitrary traditions, and subject institutions to reason. On the other hand, he reveals a limit. Happiness cannot always be calculated, justice cannot be reduced to utility, and dignity cannot be added up. Utilitarianism is a necessary philosophy, but not a sufficient one. It is a starting point, not an end point. To conclude on Bentham is to recognize that his principle of utility continues to shape our debates, our policies, and our collective choices. It is to acknowledge that, in some sense, we are all utilitarians. Whenever we weigh pros and cons, whenever we try to maximize well-being. But it is also to recognize that utilitarianism must be complemented by other principles and values to guard against its excesses. Bentham's thought is, ultimately, an invitation to judge our actions by their consequences, to care for the happiness of the many, to reject privilege and unjust traditions. But it is also an invitation not to be trapped by calculation, to keep alive the questions of dignity, justice, and freedom. Utilitarianism is a compass, but it does not draw the map. It is up to us to use it with discernment, prudence, and humanity.